Hi, everyone. This is the second portion of the lesson on the types of government. Today, we're specifically going to focus on different types of government that have more centralized control from the government agency. The first type of government we're going to talk about is a dictatorship. By definition, a dictatorship is a government with a single ruler who has ultimate authority and power. Typically speaking, dictatorships do not last long term because people get frustrated with that person having too much power and ultimately overthrow them. The sovereignty of a dictatorship is a dictator. Sometimes in some dictatorships, they do not call themselves a dictator in an effort to really protect the idea of how much power they've come to have. The power comes from force, typically conducted by military or individuals that work for the dictator. Fear as to what would happen if you don't follow that person in charge, such as which was seen under Hitler. Suppression of opposition. So basically, there are extreme consequences for people who oppose the dictator, so then they won't overthrow them. The legitimacy comes through propaganda, where they are basically fooling individuals who are living into that society into following what they're saying, and manipulation, which is looking at, again, how they are kind of scripting um, things in a certain way in order to make it so people don't realize how forceful that person in charge is. The authority comes from the ruling elite, which is typically how that person got to be in power. An example would be North Korea. In North Korea, Kim Jong Un is ultimately in power of both the military as well as the economy and politics, and is able to basically do whatever he wants and has a way to enforce that. An oligarchy is somewhat similar to a dictatorship. However, a oligarchy is looking at a small group of people who hold the power, versus a dictatorship is just talking about one person. Again, oligarchies typically don't last long term because people become frustrated with just a couple of elite people having the power. The sovereignty comes from the elite, which is largely based off of wealth. So, typically speaking, the individuals that are a part of the oligarchy are very wealthy. Sometimes they're from the same family or from families that are connected with one another, and or the military. In a moment, we're going to look at a specific type of an oligarchy, which is called a military junta, and that is a type of oligarchy. The power within an oligarchy is in the hands of a few, so it might just be a handful of people within the same family or a handful of families within a society. The legitimacy comes from laws and institutions which have allowed them to take charge. The authority comes from the ruling elite, where people are basically afraid not to follow them. An example would be in ancient Spartan. There aren't really modern day examples of oligarchies. However, in Spartan, there was a council of elders who had ultimate charge, and there was a hierarchy of power and authority based on the military there. The next example of a type government, like I said, is a specific type of oligarchy, and that is called a military junta. Typically speaking, military juntas are temporary based governments based off of the historical events that are happening in a country at a time. By definition, a military junta is a government led by a committee of military leaders seized by force. In other words, it is when a system of a military takes over a specific location, either for a short term or long term. Sometimes they just take over until something else is put in place. Sometimes that is the long term goal of the military taking over the country. The sovereignty in a military junta comes from a military group. The power comes from military force, which is enforcing that they remain in power. The legitimacy comes from them promising to restore order and stability, especially if it came from a coup where people overthrew the government system that previously existed. The authority comes from a hierarchy of military command, so typically the people that are most in charge are the highest military based officials. Again, military juntas are typically short term. An example of a military junta was in Argentina from 1976 to 1983, when there were a series of human rights violations in place and the military basically took over. The next example is one you might be more familiar with, and that is a monarchy. By definition, a monarchy is a government where a king or a queen has supreme rule. The sovereignty means that, technically speaking, the king or queen has the final say. However, there are a lot of monarchies today that are considered figureheads, and they have a parliamentary system, which is basically a Congress in addition to the monarchy, such as that is found in the UK. The power comes from a royal bloodline, so it's typically hereditary, where it's passed down from generation to generation. In some monarchies, especially historical based monarchies, they were passed down to the oldest son. However, there are some other monarchies that allow females to also take charge or not necessarily go to the oldest sibling. The legitimacy comes from family history and tradition. So, typically speaking, governments that have a monarchy, it's because the people respect the monarchy and continue to allow them to be a part of the government system. In the case of the United Kingdom, even though the royal family really doesn't have any government based power, this tradition of having a monarchy that has dated back centuries is something that is of cultural relevance, and consequently, the members of the royal family have more power because people respect them. The authority comes from the acceptance of the people. There aren't really necessary examples of active monarchies today. The best example would be the United Kingdom. However, the United Kingdom also has a parliamentary system who is responsible for the day to day responsibilities. In a lot of ways, King Charles, as well as the rest of the royal family, is more figureheads. Yes, they are a part of important meetings and ceremonies and things like that. However, they do not have any legal power individually. Their power comes from people respecting their opinion and wanting them to be a part of more events. The last type of government we're focusing on is called a theocracy. By definition, a theocracy is a government where the authority or power comes from a divine source. The sovereignty is religious leaders. So, in some societies, these are individuals who the people within that society believe are gods or goddesses. This was especially true in ancient societies, such as ancient Egypt, where they believed the pharaohs had godlike features. In more recent theocracies, this is typically religious leaders, which are individuals who the people in that society either feel can speak directly to the god or goddesses, and or are someone who truly understands the religious texts and can enforce it. Their power comes from the interpretation of religious texts. There can be theocracies of various types of religion, but that religion is usually considered part of the government system. So, in addition to having various law documents, the most important is generally some form of religious text. The legitimacy comes from the religious doctrine, which basically supports that person being in charge. The authority comes from chosen or appointed by a deity. This was especially true in a lot of the ancient civilizations. A modern day example of a theocracy is Vatican City, where the Pope is ultimately in charge. And there are a couple of other examples in the Middle East as well, which have Islam based leaders.